What historical fact makes you cry? This soldier, I realized, must have had friends at home and in his regiment, yet he lay there deserted by all except his dog. I looked on, unmoved, at battles which decided the future of nations. Tearless, I had given orders which brought death to thousands. Yet here I was stirred, profoundly stirred to tears. And by what? By the grief of one dog, Napoleon Bonaparte, on finding a dog beside the body of his dead master licking his face and howling, on a moonlit field after a battle. Napoleon was haunted by this scene until his own death. Napoleon had a funny relationship with dogs. He feuded with his wife's pug, had his life saved by a Newfoundland, wrote an op-ed about how not liking dogs made you a disloyal person, but also made it illegal to name a dog after him. Then there was this tidbit, and finally the fact that he kept a dog in his exile that he would take long walks with. Once, during a naval engagement, he even surrendered to a dog. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The doors to the exit and the stairwells were locked. So you either had to jump out the window or be burned alive. I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, but regulations are written in blood. Sadly, it takes a tragedy to enact change. The Triangle Shirtwaist fire is why all buildings must have outward opening doors that cannot be locked at it. Doors cannot be locked from the inside. There must be a source of egress for those in the building. Sacagawea, who accompanied Lewis and Clark on their expedition to explore the lands we now know as the Western United States, had a vital coincidence on the journey that always makes me emotional to think about. She was born a Shoshone but was taken around the age of 12 and made a slave to the Hidatsa. After being with them for 3 or so years, she was sold to a French man named Toussaint Charbonneau, who took her as a wife. When Lewis and Clark met her, she was about 16 years old and pregnant with Charbonneau's child. The birth was a tough one and Lewis helped with the child's safe delivery before Sacagawea and Charbonneau joined them on the expedition. Lewis and Clark knew they would meet the Shoshone on their journey and were hoping Sacagawea could help them procure some supplies, especially horses, to help them cross the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea didn't speak English. She spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa. Charbonneau spoke Hidatsa and French, and one of the members of Lewis and Clark's expedition spoke French and English. Suffice to say, translation was complicated and complex. When the expedition finally came upon the Shoshone's territory, they agreed to meet and hear Lewis and Clark's proposal. They sat down around the fire and began negotiations. The chief of the tribe began to speak with Sacagawea and the conversation proceeded rapidly. The others, unable to really understand what was going on, were confused when she and the chief began to cry, and then to embrace. In the years since her capture, it turned out, Sacagawea's brother had become chief. He had believed her dead and she did not recognize him at first. The celebration, when the tribe learned who she was, and the appreciation bestowed upon Lewis and Clark for returning her, is hard to completely express. From Wikipedia, Lewis recorded their reunion in his journal shortly after Captain Clark arrived with the interpreter Charbonneau, and the Indian woman, who proved to be a sister of the chief Kamiwait. The meeting of those people was really affecting, particularly between Sacagawea Garwea and an Indian woman, who had been taken prisoner at the same time with her, and who had afterwards escaped from the Minters and rejoined her nation. Whenever I start to think about what she went through, from her capture and slavery among the Hidatsas, to her being taken as a wife by Charbonneau, traveling across largely unknown lands with people whose language she didn't speak, to finally being reunited with her family, it always makes me emotional. After the Pearl Harbor attack, at least some men were alive in a pocket of air inside one of the capsized ships. Navy personnel could hear them banging on the hull and trying to signal for help, but there was no way to get at them safely. The water was full of fuel and oil, so blowtorches weren't a workable idea. And there was no way for divers to get into the ship because the damage had rendered the whole thing a death trap of twisted steel. There wasn't even any way to communicate with the trapped men. So the guards at Pearl Harbor had to listen to those calls for help getting weaker and weaker, while inside everyone slowly suffocated. When they hauled the ship up for scrap later, there were 16 notches scratched onto the wall of that compartment, which means at least one casualty of Pearl Harbor lived until December 23, 1941. God damn. 16 days. Good Lord. 16 days. My heart hurts. Jesus Christ, the psychological effects on the guys who had to hear that for 2 weeks. I can't even imagine. Teddy Roosevelt's mother Mitty and his wife Alice, who had just given birth days before, both died in the same house on the same day, hours apart from each other. In his diary entry that day, he drew a large black X and scribbled, "The light has gone out of my life." That's some heavy shit right there, man. He lost his son Quentin too in World War I. It especially hurts if you understand Roosevelt's ideology of exuberance. He would enter rooms as if at a run, he joked in the face of assassination attempts, he believed in being alive with a capital A. But that day, the light has gone out of my life. The story of Joe Arity. Joe was tested and found to have an IQ of 46, and the mind of a 6-year-old. Despite this, Joe Arity was executed at the age of 23 by the state of Colorado. In addition, Joe was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted and the victim of a coerced confession. Joe's mental challenges were so significant that he didn't even understand he was about to die as they walked him to the gas chamber while held on death row during the appeals process. Arity often played with a toy train 9 given to him by prison warden Roy Best. The warden said that Arity was the happiest prisoner on death row. 7. He was liked by both the prisoners and guards. Best became one of Arity's supporters and joined the effort to save his life. 6. He said of Arity before his execution, he probably didn't even know he was about to die, all he did was happily sit and play with a toy train I had given him. 1. For his last meal, Arity requested ice cream. When questioned about his impending execution, he showed blank bewilderment. 7. He did not understand the meaning of the gas chamber, telling the warden no, Joe won't die. 10. He was reported to have smiled while being taken to the gas chamber. Momentarily nervous, he calmed down when the warden grabbed his hand and reassured him. 7-11 Whenever I think about him smiling and walking to his death, it makes me fucking ill. And deeply ashamed of the system of governance that allowed it to happen, even 80 years removed from it. What a disgrace, man. Never heard of him, but fuck, that's depressing. I must be confusing this execution with another one. Long ago, I read about a mentally challenged man being executed. He was given his last meal, but didn't eat the dessert, telling the guards he was saving it for later. And they pardoned him 70 plus years later. Who the fuck cares at that point? I learned about this in a Dan Carlin podcast. During the German-Soviet War, there was a Red Army soldier who sang each night with a hauntingly beautiful voice. His comrades would give him their tea rations and scarves to protect his larynx. One night, he couldn't sing because he had gotten sick. A German soldier crawled across no man's land and tossed something into the Soviet trench. The Soviet soldiers thought it was a grenade. However, it was a package containing a letter asking if the singer was okay and if he needed medicine. A truly heartwarming moment in an otherwise horrific front. The Christmas truce of 1914 is also amazing. Soldiers created an unofficial truce for Christmas and celebrated the eve and the day together. I have also heard that the soldiers refused to fight each other for weeks after because they actually saw the humanity in each other. It was after threat of tyranny and execution that they began to fight. Edit. The soldiers on both fronts were switched with soldiers from different fronts to keep the fight going. I'm glad to come across the occasional wholesome story in amongst all of these depressing tales. One of the girls in the Donner Party was fed her dead mother and told afterwards. They had an agreement to not feed people their family members, but they had broken off from the camp in an attempt to find rescue. She would randomly burst into tears about it at school years later. The whole story of the Donner Party is so horrible and sad, and it bothers me that it is just used for cannibal jokes. The thing about the Donners that really gets you is that if you read the accounts, you're confused in your 21st century thinking. To us, all these people in wagons were pioneers, explorers, outdoors people. We think that should be able to hunt, and clean meat, and build shelter, and forage, etc. But what you realize whole reading is that these were not outdoors people. They were headed to California but were basically people from the suburbs. They didn't have any outdoor skills, no one knew how to do anything. It was less like pioneers in challenging times than if your plane crashed in Antarctica and you had no supplies and had never seen snow. And the craziest part isn't even the girl who ate her mom. It was the one guy with any outdoor skills, William Eddy. He shot animals, did whatever he could for the camp, but was kind of poor so no one would help him while he was helping them. Then when he saw they could escape or die, he begged someone to watch his wife and 2-year-old and set off to find help. He eventually made it out and had search and rescue parties sent, but once those groups found the camp, the rich folks paid them to save them first, and almost 100% of those people survived. So this dude had to go back to the camp himself and beg people to help him. He finally got like one guy to go back to the camp, but by the time they got there his wife and the other lady, who had been taking care of like 9 orphan kids, had just died and the kids were defenseless. The guy literally shows up to find one of the last adult men eating the meat off the bone of his toddler's leg. Even then the guy basically can't ignore his humanity and tells the other guy to get out or be murdered. I wouldn't have made the same offer. TL, DNR, William Eddy was the hero of the Donner Party but was screwed over and had his whole family eaten. It gets worse. They didn't have to starve. Local Indians tried to approach the party to trade with them and were driven off by gunfire because the white settlers were afraid of them. If anyone would like a great telling of the Donner Party, may I suggest the last podcast on the left. They add some comedy in there for relief, but do not skip the gnarly details. Don't forget the instance where a man was dying and could only tell his daughters how much he loved them, so much so that he wanted them to eat him, survive, and make it to California. That's both disturbing and heart-wrenching at the same time, showing the love a parent can have for their children. The kneel down of Willy Brandt, German Chancellor of 1969 to 1974. He was visiting the ghetto of Warschau and kneeled to apologize for the German war crimes, surprising everybody. The thing that really gets to me was the backstory. Brandt emigrated Germany in 1934 for being a social democrat and for having been in the resistance. He spent his time in Oslo until he was captured by Nazi soldiers there and was able to flee to Sweden. The press releases of the time really capture the strength of the moment, and I'm sorry for my translation. This is what Hermann Schreiber wrote in Der Spiegel dan niet der das nicht notig hat, de für alle, die es notig haben, aber nicht den vsies nicht wagen oder nicht können oder nicht wagen können. Dan bekend sich zu einer Schuld, under selber nicht zutragen hat, und bitte Vergebung, der selber nicht bedarf. Dan niet für Deutschland der Niels, he, who does not have to, for those who would have to, but who are not kneeling, because they cannot, or because they do not dare to, or because they cannot dare to kneel. There he admits to a guilt, he does not have to bear, and asks for a forgiveness he does not need. There he is, kneeling for Germany. Poor Willy Brandt, got fucked over so badly for something that wasn't even really his fault. For people not in the know, his political career was essentially murdered because East Germany revealed that one of his high-level aides was actually a Stasi agent, causing him to lose all credibility overnight. That's so beautiful. RMS Carpathia was the first ship to arrive on the scene when the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. Every one of the Titanic's 705 survivors were rescued by Carpathia, which made a tremendously heroic effort that night in the North Atlantic. The scene is dramatized in A Night to Remember, the classic film from 1958, and one of the more accurate, especially given the constraints of technology at that time. Harold Cottam, the radio operator on Carpathia, had already gone off duty when the Titanic's distress signals were received. He immediately conveyed the message to Captain Arthur Rostron, who jumped out of bed and ordered the ship to change course. There's this Tumblr post that summarizes what happened next far better than I could. I had to sit down and stare at a wall for a while when I first read it. Then there was the Californian. They were only 5 miles or so from the Titanic and had spotted her in the night. Unfortunately, the radio operator had gone to bed and nobody was able to hear the Titanic's distress call. The Titanic tried to get the attention of Californian by firing rockets, but Californian's captain didn't think they were a distress signal. The Californian left. Some reports say that Californian was much farther away, and it and Titanic didn't spot each other, but both spotted some other mystery ship between them that still hasn't been identified. A story from my great-grandfather who fought in WW1. Soldiers would cease fire to pick up their men's bodies and would have a smoke together, go back to their trenches and start firing again. Neither side of frontline soldiers actually wanted to be there. Just drafted for war. There's a line from the song and the band played Waltzing Matilda that talks about this, and a band played Waltzing Matilda as we stopped to bury our slain and we buried ours and the Turks buried theirs, then it started all over again. A letter from the Civil War by Sullivan Ballou. My very dear Sarah, the indications are very strong that we shall move in a few days, perhaps tomorrow. Lest I should not be able to write again, I feel impelled to write a few lines that may fall under your eye when I shall be no more. I have no misgivings about, or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. I know how strongly American civilization now leans on the triumph of the government and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and sufferings of the Revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life, to help maintain this government, and to pay that debt. Sarah, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break, and yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me unresistably on with all these chains to the battlefield. The memories of the blissful moments I have spent with you come creeping over me, and I feel most gratified to God and to you that I have enjoyed them for so long. And hard it is for me to give them up and burn to ashes the hopes of future years, when, God willing, we might still have lived and loved together, and seen our sons grown up to honorable manhood, around us. I have, I know, but few and small claims upon divine providence, but something whispers to me, perhaps it is the wafted prayer of my little Edgar, that I shall return to my loved ones unharmed. If I do not, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I love you, and when my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name. Forgive my many faults and the many pains I have caused you. How thoughtless and foolish I have oftentimes been. How gladly would I wash out with my tears every little spot upon your happiness, but, oh Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they loved, I shall always be near you, in the gladdest days and in the darkest nights, always, always, and if there be a soft breeze upon your cheek, it shall be my breath, as the cool air fans your throbbing temple, it shall be my spirit passing by. Sarah, do not mourn me dead, think I am gone and wait for thee, for we shall meet again. Sullivan Ballou was killed a week later at the First Battle of Bull Run, July 21, 1861. It doesn't exactly make me cry, but Albert Göring, the staunchly anti-Nazi brother of Hermann Göring, spent the Second World War helping Jews and dissidents to escape. He was caught several times, but was let off the hook due to his brother's influence within the Reich. After the war, he was shunned for his last name and his accomplishments forgotten. I take solace in the fact that he never did it for the recognition. Some of the world's greatest deeds have come from nameless men and women. Most if not all the astronauts aboard the Challenger survived the explosion. It was the crash into the water that would have killed them. I was going to mention this too, except in the context that it never should have happened. The night before the launch, NASA talked with Morton Thiokol engineers. They made the solid rocket boosters. The engineers were very concerned about the weather conditions. The lowest temperature the shuttle had ever launched in was 54 deg F. The conversation turned around to, can you prove there will be problems if we launch? And engineers had to say no, there was no proof there definitely would be problems. So they proceeded with the launch. The melted O-ring made a temporary seal, which held for about 40 to 50 seconds. If there hadn't been a strong wind shear aloft that broke the seal loose, there's a chance they might have made it to space. The worst part is that the solid rocket boosters had a history of O-ring blow-by. This was not the first time O-rings did not seal correctly. It was the first time it completely failed. NASA knew of the problem, but they didn't prioritize trying to fix it. NASA put politics and money in front of human safety. It was the first time 13-year-old me saw it. I believed what I'd read, that NASA always put human safety first. It utterly shattered my view of them. When Columbia broke up on re-entry, I wasn't surprised. This makes me so upset because it was so preventable, but they met likely a painful death, through impact. And the teacher, and her students watching. Just miserable. Didn't NASA say that they died instantly as a slight condolence to the families of the victims? The rape of Nanking in 1937, looking up photos of what the Japanese did there left me silent for a while. They raped and murdered women, bayonet babies, you can look up a photo of it. Used the wounded as rifle and bayonet practice, forced mothers on their sons and fathers on their daughters, and made a contest out of beheading civilians. There is a Japanese newspaper article you can look up about it. It's disgusting, and the worst part about it is that the Japanese government denies most of these acts, along with a lot of other war crimes that they committed afterwards. It always shakes me to my core to know that human beings are capable of doing such horrible things to one another. And smile while doing it. I can't remember his name, but this actually caused a high-ranking Nazi official stationed over there to safeguard well over 500 Chinese refugees in his multiple properties just due to how horrific it was. When he reported it to the Nazis, attempted to seek aid, and he started to publicly condemn the Japanese, he was forced to step down from the Nazi party, causing him and his family to be subjected to extreme poverty, barely surviving on scraps. After the war, when the people of Nanking heard about his plight, they collectively raised funds and resources to help him get back on his feet, and when he died of old age they raised a memorial there in his honor. Absolutely wild story. It is on the Wikipedia article somewhere in way more detail. Out of all the historical events I've learned about in detail, this one stands out as the one I was most disturbed by. The sheer hatred, evil and widespread twisted atrocities are sickening. Not to point fingers, but the Japanese during that period were ruthless, especially to the Chinese. The fact that it was a widespread example of a group effort with a specific intent to harm other people is so disturbing. A failure on so many levels. Edit. There's a bunch of other events that are also truly evil with similar outcomes, but for some reason this one always sticks out. It is a shame that the Japanese Nationalist Party denies this ever happened. Bayonet babies, you can look up a photo of it. Yeah, that's gonna be a no from me, dog. This and the Asian front in general is so overlooked as part of World War II history, it is tragic. Is a really good sub for this type of content since it highlights more morbid anecdotes and facts from the past. One that really stands out to me from the sub is this image of the Filipino zoo girl that was on display in the Coney Island Zoo in 1914. She was bound by ropes and people tossed peanuts at her. It is just heartbreaking to see something like that happen, especially to a child so young, but human zoos were a thing up until as late as 1958. I wasn't fucking ready for that. She is just a baby. I can't handle seeing the ropes on her chubby little baby arms. Fucking hell. Gotta go hug my toddler. Irish unmarried moms were sometimes required to live in institutions, raising their own babies until they were adopted. Imagine knowing how cute your kid was, taking care of it, knowing you couldn't keep it. Sometimes they were as old as 2 or 3 when adopted. The movie Philomena dealt with this topic. There is a sad but powerful Irish movie called The Magdalene Sisters about several girls in one of these places, and it is so heartbreaking. One of my favorite films though, absolutely check it out if the subject interests you. There's a storyline about this in Call the Midwife as well, excellent show. It's devastating. Many mothers wouldn't know the purpose behind the homes, they would give birth and care for their baby and then one day it would be gone. Many didn't even know where it had been taken, others still were told it had died. Fuck the Magdalene laundries, one of the worst stains on Irish history. Virginia Woolf's suicide and the note she left behind makes me fucking weep like a baby. Just the way she expresses sentiments of happiness and love to her husband, but also her guilt and struggle with mental illness, it just kills me. Please look into her sister, Vanessa Bell. She was there through it all and was the inspiration for many of her books. Vanessa also painted the covers for many, as well as a hauntingly beautiful portrait of Woolf. When Alexander Hamilton's eldest son died, his second child Angelica Hamilton had a mental breakdown and she never recovered. Sometimes, her family would walk into a room with only her in it, and she would be speaking to her dead brother. I used to be a care worker for elderly people and we had a lady in our facility who used to have a twin sister. The lady had a husband and they wanted children but she was infertile, whereas her sister could have kids but she never married. Her sister and husband were dead with no kids, she was just alone and she knew, but eventually dementia took this from her, and she would ask about her sister and husband all the time. One day I went in to give her medication and as I was in the kitchen I overheard her speaking to her husband and sister saying, "I know you're dead, but that's okay because you're here." She was lucid that evening, told me she knew she was hallucinating, but she kept talking to them anyway. Broke my heart. I miss her. And only a few years later, Alexander Hamilton died the same way. I can only imagine how much war that made her mental situation. Jesus Christ, That's terrifying. I shouldn't be here at 3 a.m. WW1 Mercy Dogs, they would go out into no man's land and find wounded soldiers. They would bring medical supplies for the soldiers to patch themselves up. Or if the soldier was too mortally wounded, stay and comfort them in their final moments. Heck, WW1 on its entirety. These were kids taken out of high school sent to die on a trench. And why? So big fat guys could redraw a map in order to improve their finances. I saw some gameplay of Battlefield 1, and I'm glad that the first moments of the game are literal kids dying in meaningless ways, taking cover in mud as bullets fly by. It is one of the most miserable times of modern history. The game Valiant Hearts has a mercy dog as one of the characters. Beautiful game. Will make you cry.
Like and subscribe for more Reddit content. Watch the next video at the top of your screen.